Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Welcome to the Bill Walton Show. I'm Bill Walton. This week, Americans for Limited Government published a provocative and insightful piece about the banking system, asking, has the United States banking system become too big to save? Here's the gist. In the past 3 years, U.S. Treasuries have increased by $7.5 trillion to finance massive spending bills that have increased our federal debt to almost a little over $31 trillion. $3 trillion of the treasuries were bought by the Federal Reserve, aka monetizing the debt, but it means the other $4 trillion were bought by U.S. financial institutions at a time when interest rates were far lower than they are today. What that may mean is that banks are sitting on more than $600 billion of unrealized losses in these bonds. Silicon Valley Bank looks to be the canary in the coal mine and maybe the first of many balance sheets are going to blow up because of mismanagement of both our fiscal and our monetary policy. The banking crises of the past quarter century have led to greater and greater centralization of our banking system, where socializing the risks, as they call it, or too big to fail, which basically means taxpayers pick up the tabs for losses. Where this looks to be heading is towards a wholly government-based financial system where everyone's bank becomes the Federal Reserve. And our money becomes a so-called central bank digital currency, which will give the federal government power over most of all of our personal financial matters and our lives. Far-fetched? I don't think so. And joining me to talk this through is Rick Manning, president of Americans for Limited Government, and its vice president, Robert Romano, author of the piece. I saw Rick recently at CPAC and told him, I like what they're writing. And he said, I sure hope so. Each one is a result of the two of us arguing for about half a day over the issues. And when I heard that, I thought, I want to join in that argument and get into learning about what we think is happening. And I think generally we're on the same page about where this might be going, but I think there's it's complicated, it's opaque, almost nobody understands it. And so our goal today is to try to simplify it for what's at stake for, regular people like us.
Well, thanks for having us, Bill. And I will tell you that process is, I think, really necessary for
the
really
process with you and Robert.
The process with Robert and I, and now with you, is necessary to really get to the bottom of things, because you have to question all the assumptions. You have to question everything about how we got here. You can't just say we're here and accept that there's a pathway that doesn't include an examination of how we got here and what the people who got us here are actually trying to do. We're for limited government. We don't want a nationalized bank system. We don't want a system where there's no risk involved in banks, because no risk means that you don't have real capitalism. You don't have the market. You don't have the market protections for the banking system, because you don't have people competing. And when you have a banking system that's based basically on how low they can get the money from the Fed so they can make a profit on the Treasury bills, then that's a system that's doomed to fail, because Treasury bills go up and down based on markets and based on the supply and demand of the marketplace. So we have a doomed to fail system because the way it's been set up, and
we have a doomed to fail system.
Yeah, because the way it's set up is it's set up based around a dependency on government debt and the trading on government debt, and it was always, for the last 10 years, 15 years, it's been dependent on that government debt becoming more and more, the interest rates going down, but the cost of the debt going down also. So they had a guaranteed profit, and that's where you end up with a challenge in terms of the banking system's overall capacity.
Robert.
Well, that's $6 trillion of new money that was created under M2 from the $7.5 trillion treasuries, and that was a 43% increase since February of 2020, which created the inflation. Which then the Fed, though, never raised interest rates until after Russia invaded Ukraine. By that time, inflation was already at 7.5%. and they've been hiking rates ever since. We just had another rate hike. We're up to 4.75 to 5% now on the federal funds rate, and they're still not above the consumer price index, which is at 6% right now. So everyone's still expecting more interest rate hikes, at least one more this year alone. And what usually that happens right before a recession is they're going to bring the funds rate right above the consumer price.
But could I boil this down, though? The banks bought treasuries, fixed rate, most of them. They bought them when rates were 1.5%, 2%.
Correct.
And the way bonds are priced is that if interest rates go up, and let's say they go to 5 or 6%, all of a sudden those bonds you bought at 1.5%, you can't get 100 cents on the dollar for them. Correct. You can get 90 cents or 85 cents or 80 cents. So it means if you're looking at your balance sheet, what you thought was worth 100 cents is now really worth much less. And that's happened throughout the banking system.
Correct.
Absolutely.
But as you know, in the banking system, you count what the value of the bond is, not what you can sell it for now. So if you have a bond that has $1,000 value, to make it easy, $1,000 value, but because interest rates have turned around on you, and you can only sell it for $850, it's counted on your balance sheet as being $1,000 worth of asset.
Well, but that sounds like China.
Well,
I mean, China it wasn't an interest rate phenomenon, but China had banks. A lot of its banks had billions, if not $1 trillion, of real estate investments and loans that went this way, and the Chinese decided to keep those at par, even though they were worthless. And so they've got many, many, many what they call zombie banks in China. And our fear here is that we end up with zombie banks here in the United States, where the assets are worth a lot less than we see on the balance sheet.
Yeah, the interesting challenge on this is when they essentially nationalized Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, they bought the treasuries. They essentially bought the treasuries for full par value.
Right, it's the bank term lending facility that they just established. It's explicitly for a year they get to consider that at 100 cent pennies on the dollar. They can, here, give us your treasuries. Now, what's I think is going to happen at the end of this, if it gets worse, is they're going to the Fed's just going to end up buying them back at 100 pennies on the dollar, just like they did in 2009 when Bernanke did the mortgage-backed securities buyout, which is now up to $2.6 trillion the Fed has on its balance sheet right now. And those are agency-backed, those are Fannie and Freddie bonds that everyone was upside down on.
How big is the Fed balance sheet now?
8.2 trillion.
And what was it in 2008?
About 800 billion. It's up tenfold.
And where'd all that money go to? Buying mortgage
treasuries.
Bonds?
Yeah, they have about more than 5 trillion of U.S. treasuries right now, and then they have the 2.6 trillion of mortgage-backed securities at the moment.
And so that's how we end up with the inflation, which is when the Treasury issues a bond and the Fed buys it, that becomes money, and money gets flushed around, and that's why we've got 6%, 7% inflation.
It peaked at 9%, more than 9% in June 2022.
Well, let's do a little trip down memory lane. In the United States, used to have a Wild West banking system. We had every state had a couple thousand banks in it. It was like the old Wild West, where you'd have a saloon and a bank. And as recently as I think 1960, we had 14,000 banks in the United States, and that's now down to about 5,000. And those 14,000, 5,000, those 9,000 that disappeared, it was through the mortgage crisis, the S&L crisis. I mean, what happened? Why did all those banks disappear?
Well, it was also because we made a decision 30-some years ago to nationalize the banking system, so they could do business outside state lines. And so the small in-state banks got bought by bigger banks that wanted to have a footprint.
I remember that. So we passed the rule. It used to be if you're a bank, you had to bank only in your own state, and then they made it cross-border, and that shoved the smaller ones out.
And so a lot of smaller banks then got consolidated. And then we had the S&L crisis, which had the same thing, where savings and loans were essentially gobbled up into the banking system. So so the system has been, over the last 30, 35 years, maybe 25 years, a consolidating system where every crisis is met with an opportunity for the big banks to take over the little banks.
And that's what happened in the 80s with the S&L crisis. If you read the Federal Reserve's history on that, it was once again being upside down on interest rates, which had to go up in order to tame the inflation of the 1970s and the early 1980s. So every time we go through this process where we're printing too much money, we're spending too much money, again, $7.5 trillion of marketable treasuries was done for COVID, so that we could do production halts, so that we could do economic lockdowns, so that we could pay people not to work. And so you had too much money chasing too few goods. By definition, that is the inflation right there. Is you don't produce enough goods on purpose, and you print too much money on purpose. And the Fed couldn't figure out that there was going to be a mismatch. Is beyond me. Why didn't they raise interest rates in 2021 when they had the chance to get this under control? Was beyond us.
Well, I think their excuse was that we were still, quote unquote, recovering from the shock of COVID. But where we really saw, in my estimation, we ended up with ego getting involved in our policy, and I will say President Trump in the last stimulus that was done in December of 2020, and then Joe Biden with a $1.9 trillion stimulus that was done in almost 3 months after he took office in 2021. Just ignited the inflation, because a lot of the money that had been sent out during COVID was sent out to basically keep people employed and things like that. The rest of it was just stimulative. It was designed to be stimulative, and truthfully, I think the Biden was mainly because he wanted to send people checks with his name on it. It really had no economic value, and we were already recovered.
Well, Trump wanted to do that
well,
too.
No doubt.
And
no
I'm a big. I like Donald Trump, but he
definitely
wanted to see that.
Well,
Trump
he spent more than Biden did when you actually added up.
He spent more. Yeah, it was hardly.
And I differentiate him. I differentiate him, and
we can pile on Joe Biden all we want.
I know we can. But I'll tell you how I differentiate it. We made a decision, Americans for Limited Government, to support the short-term things that were done to try to make sure small businesses didn't collapse. When the government made a decision that they were going to shut down the economy, that they were not going to allow people to actually make a living, and weren't going to allow people to actually go out and visit a restaurant or go to the local grocery store or the like, and they kept the Walmarts open, they kept the Amazons open, but they wouldn't let the small businesses be open. When they made that decision, the government breaks it. The government has a responsibility to try to make sure it doesn't go completely to shambles. And so we supported that initially because, quite honestly, it was the only way we could see not falling into a massive depression with people losing their jobs and being essentially destroyed.
And all the same, 25 million jobs were lost by April of 2020. But by the time Trump was leaving office, 16 million of those jobs had already been recovered. And I think attributing that to the Paycheck Protection Program, I think that's spot on. It was a wise policy, considering the fact we didn't know how long we were going to be locked down. We didn't know how bad the virus, how deadly it actually was. Thank goodness it became less deadly as it mutated. But the fact is that most of the recovery was already in place by the time Biden came in. And what Trump's comment has been since then, especially after the inflation, was that all Biden had to do was just sit back and watch as the economy fully reopened for the rest of the year in 2021. Instead, they said, let's do a few more trillion.
Well, and the irony, of course, is the reason the economy hadn't fully reopened when Trump was there was because Democrat governors in big states didn't want to give Trump credit for fully recovering the economy, so they deliberately kept their economies closed until Biden became president. Then they started reopening their economies. So you saw California, New York, Pennsylvania, others have their job losses basically got sucked up because they did the same thing that Texas, Florida did in June, July, August of 2020. They just did it 6 months later for political purposes. Essentially, they put their own people, their own population, their voters. They put a gun to their head and said, "We're not going to allow you to prosper until after Donald Trump's out, because there's nothing more important than stopping Donald Trump."
This is the Bill Walton Show. I'm here with Rick Manning and Robert Romano of Americans for Limited Government, and they're shocking me with this idea that politicians put their interest ahead of the voters and the American people. And there's gambling going on in the casino.
We're shocked.
But the thing is, I think the parallel between what happened with the lockdowns and what's happening now with the banks is that, big picture, the left is a enemy of the market. They're an enemy of small business, of entrepreneurship, of civil society. Mm-hmm. And what happened with the lockdowns was they took out tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of businesses, some of whom recovered, but many of them did not.
Correct.
And you had this ridiculous situation where Lowe's was kept open, and it was Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan decided that this department in Lowe's was essential and this other department was non-essential.
Yeah, they wouldn't allow them to buy seeds so they could grow their own food in like Home Depot or Lowe's. So they wouldn't allow them to buy gardening stuff because they want people to go out and actually grow their own food and be self-sufficient.
And they have this hostility towards self-reliance.
Yes. 100%.
Because they don't want you to be free of their power.
Self-reliance means you're not reliant on them, absolutely.
And this may sound like a conspiracy to those who are listening and watching, and it is a conspiracy, and that is what they do, and that's what we need to worry about. And that's why I'm worried about this banking situation, right. Because they don't like small banks and medium-sized banks any more than they like small business and medium business. They would just assume they went away. Because it'd be a lot easier for the federal government to control a much smaller banking system and control it the way they do J.P. Morgan and Wells Fargo and what's the other one in there? Citibank and Wells. You got the four big ones. Right. They would be happy with a banking system that had 500 banks in it, I think.
I think that's where this is headed. In fact, in Dodd-Frank, there was a mechanism to bring these companies into receivership, these small and medium, if they pose a systemic risk. That's exactly what they did with Silicon Valley Bank. And there's no incentive now
Go slower on that. Explain a little bit what do you mean systemic. What did they do? Take it down.
They followed the law. The law says that if the Treasury and the Federal Reserve and the FDIC wave a magic wand and say, you're systemically risky, they can take that company into receivership, wipe out the bondholders, wipe out the shareholders, and there's no incentive now to hold on to those stocks, which is why the regional banking index the past month is down 29%. First Republic has been under a lot of pressure, down 88% in the past month alone. And this is the mechanism, a perverse incentive in Dodd-Frank to put pressure on the small and medium. And then the only solution is further consolidation, more receivership. And you're going to put what if the bigger banks start getting similar pressure? I think is where this is going.
Well, but the key is the bigger banks are protected under too big to fail. And so the bigger banks are guaranteed under Dodd-Frank that they can't fail, that we're going to bail them out.
What does that mean exactly?
Does
that mean basically they're going to flood them with cash or something?
The internal mechanism that's supposed to work is that the banks are going to actually have to pay a higher rate, which means their depositors
assessments
and are going to have higher assessments. And it's going to basically it's a backhanded way of taxing people because they're just going to tax the people who actually have their deposits at the banks. You're not going to be able to get paid for interest for your various accounts and the like. But that's how they devised it, and Congress devised it that way on purpose, because Congress really, really hated when they had to make votes about whether to bail out Lehman Brothers and the like. They hated that. And remember, when they were having those votes, the Republicans in the House didn't vote for the bailouts the first day. They said no, and they got pounded by Wall Street. And the next day they collapsed and they voted for the bailouts. Well, the Republicans, when Dodd-Frank came around, which was 2 years later, they said nobody in Congress wanted to have that vote. So they outsourced the decision-making
to this
council. And the challenge with the systemic risk is twofold. It's not a defined term. So they found, for instance, Silicon Valley Bank to have systemic risk because it was a bunch of lefties who had their deposits there who were investing in things they liked and were engaged in woke capitalism in terms of the Silicon Valley startups and the like, all green agenda stuff. So they said, no, that's systemic risk. We can't allow those people to lose. But if you have a bank in Oklahoma and your bank is mainly people are drilling and taking and wildcatters and the like, they're not going to get bailed out. They're not going to have more than $250,000 covered.
Sort of like East Palestine's disaster relief aid that
East
never
Palestine
came
doesn't count. But if
because they all voted for Trump.
But if they'd been in San Francisco, you darn bet that every single federal government official had been there.
Let's look at Silicon Valley. I mean, as I understand it, I've heard different numbers. Only 5 to 15% of their deposits were covered by the $250,000 insurance cap. What's your number? Is it?
It was 90% were uninsured.
Okay, so
North of-
10% was
Yeah.
insured. So I meant 90% was uninsured.
They were the second most, had the second most exposure in terms of all the banks.
Well, and who were their clients? The clients were all the big VC firms and all the big venture capital
100% true.
investment
also big
firms.
companies like Raku.
And every single one of them, I think I could probably say every single one, with that exception, is a big Democrat donor.
The only one who wasn't was Peter Thiel.
Did Peter Thiel have money in Silicon Valley?
He had 50, what was it, 50 million in there?
Well, he advised people pull out about
He took
40 billion.
His founders fund was the first ones who said, wait a second, this isn't solvent, and sent advice out to people he was.
And then everybody in
said,
Silicon Valley got on Twitter and said, let's get out of here. It was our first virtual bank run.
Yeah, but Thiel had $50 million of personal cash in that he would have got 250,000 back.
Okay. Well, anyway,
but
except for Peter Thiel,
okay. Sorry,
it was primarily people on the left,
true.
and they bailed them out, and it's egregious where they're just taking, and I understand Signature Bank is similarly favored because they've got a lot of depositors who are Democrat and on the left.
Barney Frank was on the board.
Yeah, and then the other one, First Republic, is almost in the same category.
It's
in California.
Very similar to Silicon Valley Bank.
It has a lot of uninsured deposits as well. But in fact, it was Silicon Valley saying we need to raise $2.25 billion of more capital that preceded the Founders Fund and everyone else saying that they needed to get out because, the uninsured deposits
but
are in danger.
these were big boys that put their money into these institutions. They knew the $250,000 rule.
Yes.
And yet they figured, well, there's really not that much risk because we are who we are, and they're going to bail us out if there's a problem. And that's, in fact, what happened.
That's exactly what happened. And if it happened to you or me, we would have been creamed. That's and so the rest of us have to follow the 250,000 rule. No, well, if it's above that, we're risking that. And they didn't have to.
That's where I see this as much more than just a traditional banking
100%
crisis,
true.
Financial crisis. I think there's a political agenda at work here that's really deeply concerning.
Yeah, it's why
it's part of the weaponization of our money theme.
Well, let's put it this way. The old days of where you sit there and it's based on decisions in Washington are based upon various facts other than who gets hurt and who gets helped. Those days don't exist. If they ever did exist, they certainly don't exist now. The first and foremost consideration is who gets hurt and who gets helped. And that's a political decision. And if you happen to have invested in the right candidate, you get helped. And if you didn't, you get hurt. And that's the problem with corporate cronyism all throughout the system.
Well, the weaponization of the government, or under Joe Biden, we've seen a weaponization of the government to push diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've seen the ESG, environmental, social, and government's pushed, and that's essentially a shorthand for climate initiatives. I mean, there's a little bit of S and G in there, but it's mainly climate. And the climate agenda is, as we know, the left agenda. But I think it's not just the agencies that have been weaponized. The regulators have been weaponized. I mean, if you look at the Federal Reserve, look at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. The head of that is a woman who, would she get her PhD in gender studies or I'm all for gender, but I'm just saying it's not exactly it's not a degree in banking.
I could make a joke about I studied gender.
I would like it. I would like to hear something funny.
But I studied gender a lot in college, but at University of Southern California. But the truth of the matter is, I didn't get a degree in it. Okay, so it's a noti.
So you studied gender?
I was studying it closely, but and I think most guys would admit that they were too. Hey, I found my wife there. We've been married for over 40 years. I did well in my gender studies degree. It worked.
I don't think that's what she's doing. But
not what they had in mind.
They're writing, they've got all sorts. Go on their website and take a look at the papers they write on the website about the fact that monetary policy ought to be based on social justice and equity.
That's so dangerous. So dangerous. And if you look at the perverse incentives that are in ESG and the regulations that have pushed retirement savings into that, there's about more than 30 trillion of retirement savings. Unfortunately, the Labor Department only addresses about 1/3 of that in terms of the regulations. We haven't even been really able to tackle this, I think, from the Republican side of this question for more than
Well, I had Pat
15
Pizzell
years.
on. He was
Right. He was deputy secretary.
Briefly acting secretary, and they put together some rules that didn't allow pension managers to use ESG. I don't know how you're making a face. Maybe it wasn't as tough as we all would have liked.
I wish.
They made an attempt to do that. The challenge is in the law that they have to write it under. All you have to do is make sure that the decisions are based on fiduciary concerns and not other concerns.
Right.
And so you can invest in, if the government is picking winners and losers.
See, the problem is you guys, you know the minutia of all this.
I know. Sorry about that. And say I was at the Labor Department in the Bush administration, and the first ESG.
Well, so you really know.
It was the same thing.
The first ESG guidance at that time came out in 2008. And I was the PR guy who had to sell it, and we got great press on it, and I got in trouble for it. But nonetheless, it was
good deed.
But it was, in fact, at the time, it made sense because ESG was, we're going to invest in crazy stuff and it's not profitable. 12 years later, the same language was no longer sufficient because the fact is, because of the government incentives that have been built into the system to push the environmental stuff, investing in coal didn't make sense, but investing in windmills did. And so when the government picked winners and losers,
But that's,
that changed the investing dynamic.
I totally agree with you. Let me amplify. The way I would say it is that coal's subjected to free market, return on investment, return on capital, that sort of thing, and it's also out of favor, and so it's losing its customer base, so it's not a good investment. Wind and solar, because of subsidies, government money coming into it, has become investable, but it's only because of trillions of dollars of taxpayer subsidies and outright government financing for it that it has become investable. So we've got this blurring of the capital markets where it's been so distorted by Robert.
Well, you have these BlackRock and Vanguard are able to take over even the boards of directors of companies like Exxon, with the goal of restricting the energy supply, which raises prices and resulted in record profits. So if the Republican rule on this is only going to address whether or not it's profitable, we'll never get to the bottom of it. I just say it violates antitrust to price gouge the American people like that. So maybe they should apply antitrust to no retirement investments into companies that are violating antitrust. If they're doing racial and gender hiring quotas, that violates Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. They could restrict that and say, hey, let's, enforce the law.
What a crazy idea. Actually, and enforce the law is state AGs can do this, okay? If somebody's engaged in racial preference hiring against the laws of the state,
or the
feds, the state AGs can actually go after it. So in states like Texas,
you mean
go after
ESG,
companies that are engaged in ESG on the personnel side, doing the equity hiring and the like, because that in essence is a violation of the Constitution itself, which says
equal protection.
You're not allowed to make a choice based on the color of somebody's skin. John Robertson hearing the case on University of North Carolina and Harvard, where they're doing racial preferences for admissions and denying Asians the ability to get into the schools and preferring other races. He said, I thought we fought a civil war about this about 160 years ago. Didn't we get this settled? And the University of North Carolina and Harvard, which were trying to kind of defend the racial preference admission standards, had no answer.
No.
So I think we're going to see the Supreme Court go after that, which will then harden the capacity to go after these companies that are doing ESG and force them to back away from that and start hiring on merit. Because when you don't hire on merit, when you don't do things on merit, you lose, and we no longer succeed as a country.
Okay. This is the Bill Walton Show. I'm here with Rick Banning and Robert Romano of Americans for Limited Government. And I thought this would be a wide-ranging conversation. We've gone from interest rates to admission policy at Harvard.
True enough. But remember, Harvard still has their $50 billion endowment, so they're doing okay.
They're doing okay. But let's wander back into banking, since that's sort of what our topic is, although I think everything's our topic. We talked about Silicon Valley. I don't think we talked about ESG and the woke kind of things they did. They didn't go broke because they were woke. I mean, and I read something today I thought was very good. They went broke because they were spending all their management time and attention on being woke, and they weren't spending any management time and attention on interest rate and balance sheet management. And, had somebody been not thinking about all the great social things they ought to be doing and instead focusing on their balance sheet, they would have noticed that they had this mounting loss in their bond portfolio, and they would have begun to hedge that, and they would have gotten themselves out from under this. Yet they went for 9 months without a risk manager. Instead, they had a diversity, equity, and inclusion person in that job.
What a distraction. But Jerome Powell was just saying in his press conference after the Fed meeting that they definitely were not managing what they called the duration risk in terms of having these long-term bonds.
Duration risk, amplify.
Well, if you just buy a 10-year bond, you got to wait for that thing to come to maturity. If you buy a 1 year or 3 month, you can hold on to it for a little while.
The durations, you got to hold it to get paid 100 cents on the dollar, and
Precisely.
In the meantime, it can be worth almost nothing because of high interest rates.
And a shorter-term bond, which matures faster, doesn't drop as much in value.
Exactly. Okay, I just wanted to.
Better not need cash, right?
For those non-walks who are paying attention, I wanted to try to explain
trust me,
that.
we've had to learn more about the banking system than we ever wanted to know. I just wanted to go and give them my money and assume it was going to be safe. Okay, that's what I wanted to know.
Yeah.
But they forced us to have to learn about how this works. And you're exactly right. Your initial premise is exactly right. This is an attempt to consolidate the banking system so it's more controllable. And why they want it more controllable is because they do want to go to digital currency. They want to go to digital currency for everybody and not allow you to have cash in your hand, not allow you to, you have to essentially ask permission. And if you don't believe that, try to take $10,000 out of the bank right now and not have them, the Treasury's notified when you try to take more than a certain amount out.
We've had a 10,000 rule for decades, though.
Exactly right. But you see, it's the precedent. It's the precedent that they can set that there are triggers.
So if I go to my bank and I take out $9,950, do you think they notify the feds that somebody's doing that?
Yes.
So that 10,000 rule is simply what you can't get at the teller, but you end up in their system. There's a notification. We've got a customer here who's pulling out lots of cash.
They've got that data. And so I think since the financial crisis, they even have better data now, and so they can see where the runs are occurring in real time.
Because I've had people say, gee, our currency, you're going to need currency in case we have some cataclysmic crash. And I think, well, if I go to the bank and start looking at 5, 10, 20,000, even if I send Sarah to do it, I'm sure she's on camera. She's very suspicious, but they're still going to put you on a list, and they're still going to manage that. And central bank digital currencies just take that totally out of the equation because, in effect, your checking account is on a ledger at the Federal Reserve.
100%. The reason I brought up the 10,000 is because it's the predicate.
Yeah.
They've already started having measuring that, and now the system's built. It's actually built to try to drive people into using strict digital currency, get us used to only using credit cards.
And use the big banks.
And use the big banks.
So who wrote the regulations?
The big banks.
Precisely.
Yeah.
I think that's what the incentive was with Dodd-Frank. And when you would get to this situation again, I don't know if, is this an unintended consequence? They seem to be unprepared for it. When Silicon Valley Bank was going down. So I think that the regulators were caught by surprise. I think the Board of Governors was caught by surprise. So I'll disfavor the idea that this was an unintended consequence because Congress should really re-examine what was done with Dodd-Frank, which that orderly liquidation fund, which is what they're using, is
they're not going to unwind Dodd-Frank.
Well, it's a lethal threat, though, to the private sector if Treasury and the Federal Reserve and the FDIC can just say that a financial company or a non-bank financial style company can
But they're never going to give up that power.
They can just take over any company in America under that onus and say, you're systemically risky.
Yeah. Well, I've used this story way too many times, so bear with me if you've ever heard it. But, Jamie Dimon and Lloyd Blankfein, who was at the time chairman or CEO of Goldman Sachs after Dodd-Frank passed several years later, were at an investor conference telling people about why they should invest in their banks. And they said, well, Dodd-Frank basically built an economic moat around our business model. And the capital requirements and the regulatory requirements are so high now because of Dodd-Frank that you can't start something new to compete with this. And the proof is what's happened with community banks. In America, and this is my world, the entrepreneurial world, there used to be 70, 80, 90, 150 community banks started every year. Entrepreneurs deciding they wanted to do something. Since Dodd-Frank, I think we've had a total of about, I've heard as low as 5, I've heard as many as 15, but that's over a 12-year period. And so new bank creation has been brought to a halt. And these people, and JP Morgan, just to put the icing on the cake, last year had return on equity of 18%. And banks like that used to be around 8%.
Right.
So that regulatory barrier that they've got and that protection from the government is massively profitable.
It's a regulatory capture when you create a favorable.
Well, I think they've captured the regulator.
Well, no, what I mean by that, though, is
I guess that is what it means, though.
It means that the bigger entities are then able to, via the regulations, they're the only ones who can meet up with those requirements, plus they're too big to fail. So you result in more consolidation, what we were referring to earlier. And I do believe that is a part of the plan there, is to get fewer and fewer banks. And then you can move, you say, oh, well, if it's too risky to go withdraw money from the bank, no more cash. And I think that's where you wind up. You get to the end game, and we're getting there quickly.
Well, the other thing that is a proof point on it, under the Obama administration, there was an active policy to debank certain industries and use the banking system and pressure banks to get out of gun dealers in particular.
Right, and that's part of the ESG thing as well.
And that's one thing, also part of the ESG thing, which is puts private capital into that game to encourage people and give leverage to force people to debank. So we already have a federal banking system that is actively seeking to debank unfavored enterprises and unfavored people. When you put on top of that digital banking system, which then allows for them to control the actual flow of capital to individuals and decide what that flow is going to be to individuals, no matter how much is in your account. When you combine the debanking with the unfavorable, with the idea that they're going to control your capital flows, at that point you have complete control over somebody's wealth, and it's no longer your money anymore. It's theirs because they determine whether you can use it or not.
That's why Congress, Republicans really should be protecting entrepreneurship. They should be protecting small businesses. I think that's why they're elected. But when you look at federal law, there's nothing protecting somebody from being removed from a big bank, which we're going to need now, right? Would you want to put your money into one of the smaller banks for protection if they're not protected? But nothing that prevents political discrimination at these financial institutions, although there are civil rights protections in banking law. Republicans should propose expanding that franchise, I believe, because we need those protections. Small businesses, really small businesses, are getting discriminated right now because of Section 230 on social media platforms, but also on crowdfunding platforms, which have Section 230. They're not banks. But people get discriminated on those platforms. So if you want to go out and start a small business right now on the internet using e-commerce, you're going to be depending on financial institutions that have it in for you.
I wonder when YouTube and Google are going to find talking about central bank digital currencies in opposition is something they ought to censor. I'm wondering whether or not this, this show has been pulled.
Hopefully not today.
A couple of times from YouTube.
Hopefully not today.
Because of the masks and vaccine discussions we've had.
Well, this is dangerous discussion.
I'm not a big fan of either.
It's actually true.
Yeah.
And it's something that people should be aware of. I am going to say one thing though. We really dodged a bullet because Jerome Powell was reappointed to be chairman of the Fed, and that wasn't President Biden's first choice. His first choice was a woman who, and I don't remember her name, unfortunately, but somebody who really believed that the Fed's job was to enforce ESG, and their job was to engage in social engineering rather than being involved in trying to make sure the banking system doesn't fail. And so there's that whole strain on the left that the banking system is nothing more than a means to create an end. It's not the way to create free flow of commerce.
Was this the woman that ended up a
That's who I'm
deputy
talking about.
Secretary of Treasury? She's married to Jamie Raskin.
Our last name's Raskin. Emily?
No, her name isn't Raskin. They did.
Oh, you're right. I don't remember her name.
Anyway,
she didn't get in.
She didn't get in because of her radical view.
Right.
But I think.
But the point is,
but it's coming.
That is now.
It's coming.
At some point we talked about the Overton window, and the Overton window would tell you stretch the credulity by putting somebody who's so radical out there that people say you can't do that. But the next time somebody with the same ideas are out there, suddenly they become a little more credible.
I want to start using the Overton window all the time. I mean, Kenny's our producer here. You're going to get bored with this. But the Overton window when did it come into existence? 50 years ago,
Yeah.
by some really interesting writer, and said that there's a life of ideas, which is where, in the Overton window, I guess, is sort of like a Venn diagram or a circle like that, where an idea starts out as something that's absolutely reprehensible, far-fetched, it'll never happen, don't even talk about it. And then some people start socializing it, and then it becomes, well, that's really out there, but maybe, and then it becomes something like, well, gee, maybe we ought to start thinking about that because such and such, and then it becomes, well, maybe, is there a way to make this policy, and then it becomes law.
Right.
And so look at the trans bathrooms we have now. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, would you talk about a trans bathroom?
No. I don't know. And would you talk about a biological boy going to a biological girl's bathroom in fifth grade?
Exactly. So what my thought is, we got to use that same sort of thinking for some radical change to some of these institutions that we're so troubled by.
100%. And that's really, all of our arguing tends to be about that, trying to figure out how do we really fix this.
I think we got to go big.
We do have to go big. And one of Robert's ideas that is good, I'll let him talk about the housing idea.
Everything that the Fed's holding, that's about the $2.6 trillion of mortgage-backed securities, Fannie and Freddie. That's about 28 million homes in the GSEs, plus the public housing system. You could just end the Soviet style. The government is our landlord system just by turning title over to the current tenants of any government-financed housing. And that's what Poland did. That's what some of the former Soviet republics did, because at the time of the Soviet Union collapsing, there was no private housing market. But I think you would get rid of a lot of the debt overhang in the banking system right now. And it seems like they were anxious to get rid of their mortgage-backed securities in 2008.
Are these privately owned and financed by Fannie and Freddie, or are they government housing?
They're GSEs.
Here's what we kind of bounce off of each other. I've limited to, when I talk about this, I limited to FHA has foreclosures. Okay, you got Fannie and Freddie who have foreclosures. You have the whole public housing system. If you took the foreclosures and you did a deal and you put the foreclosures into the hands of the locals to then figure out how to deal with their homeless populations and to deal with that, get the federal government out of the business of owning homes. We've got more housing stock than we know what to do with, and we have the capacity to solve so many problems if we just let that housing stock be used where people know how to use it, know what to do with it. And so it seems to me that getting us out of that also has the happy occurrence of when you also get rid of Fannie and Freddie, you get rid of the GSEs, what you end up doing is you actually create a private mortgage banking system again, where we aren't essentially having our mortgages sold to Fannie and Freddie before, the minute we write the refinance, and Wells Fargo is merely somebody who's processing the mortgage, and they aren't actually the people who hold the mortgage. Let's have a private mortgage finance system. Let's create real competition. Let's create a system that actually competes for our business and acts like a private entity as opposed to a government-controlled entity. That's how you save the banking system, is you reprivatize them.
How would you do that?
Well, in terms of the Fannie Freddie thing, in terms of the housing,
Congress would have to do it.
Congress has to do that. And what you have to do is you have to get somebody elected president who says, this is the big idea solution for one of the things we want to do. Margaret Thatcher tried it in Great Britain.
Yeah, well, I wrote the Treasury transition plan in 2016, and that was one of our centerpiece items. Shut down Fannie and Freddie, get us out of that business. That was almost 8 years ago.
I think there's
And
liquidity
Steve
concerns.
Mnuchin was hardly a champion of that idea.
Well, the fact of the matter is, and
he was not a champion.
This goes to the Trump transition, which I was also on.
I know, you were at Labor?
I was at Labor.
Yeah.
And I was surprised. I met with the head of OMB at some point in about the first year. And he says, oh, well, we need to have you guys, all you conservative guys, tell us the things that are wrong and all the things you need to do. And I asked him, we produced a series of books, the transition team, a series of books from the floor to the ceiling. Very smart people, real knowledge. Has anybody read them? Okay, is anybody even aware of them? And the fact is the Trump transition, the challenge with the policy part of the Trump transition is it didn't equate to the people who actually had to do it. Okay, the people were actually the implementers inside.
In other words, the transition that we were involved with was a catastrophe.
I would say that the ideas that
It was frustrating.
It was frustrating. I would say that the ideas that came out of it were very valuable.
Well, they're great ideas,
but the fact is you have to marry the ideas with the personnel. Because as Reagan said, personnel is policy, and Trump's big
my
fail was
theory
no
is here's
personnel.
what's happened. Trump's up in Trump Tower.
Right.
You've got all of us down in Washington. We are, we're very bright, movement-oriented people, know a lot. We write these great plans, and Trump's attitude was, well, these people are Washington people. They're not New York people like me. And so he basically discounted almost all the work that was done by the transition. And it was
If
a
he
big
was allowed to
mistake.
see it.
It was a big mistake.
It was a big mistake. And because we had the same goal as he did, would drain the swamp and limit the size and scope of federal government. And there was a lot of good stuff there. There's stuff you could reject, but there was a lot of good stuff in there. And I don't think anybody who came in, unless they were in the transition team, the policy part of it,
Didn't use it.
not a single one of them knew it. And the failure of the system, and this just gets down to the way the policy works, they protected every single cabinet secretary from knowing anything the transition team did because they didn't want them to have to answer questions on it. They wanted to say, oh, well, I'm not sure.
Oh, gosh, I remember that.
And so
I
consequently,
remember that we had these briefing books, and they couldn't use them because they
couldn't
didn't
use
want
anything
to
that
have
actually-
ownership of the...
right. So the idea was so they could be ignorant and not say anything. They weren't and couldn't be held accountable. The
Yeah.
idea was, oh, we just have to get them confirmed. So they get confirmed 2.5, 3 months later.
Yeah.
And so they're trying to hit the ground running, but they don't have but the existing system just kept rolling. So at that point, they're not agents of change. They're agents of just trying to keep all the squirrels going in the right direction. And that's not how you drain the swamp. You drain the swamp, you make real change by having the leaders bought into the change and having them driving it from day one.
Yeah, well,
and we didn't have that with our cabinet secretaries, and it was, once again, a failure of the way we did transition.
Well,
To go back to the GSEs, though, and how to privatize
Back
them.
to what we're supposed to be talking about?
Well, no, just the
I don't
border
remember.
system. Think of
I've
the-
lost track.
Well, just think of the challenge there, right? So, like, even if you wanted to privatize Fannie and Freddie, and that's 28 million homes right there, do you want to just turn that title over to the woke banking system that's all driven by equity? I'd say don't trust them.
But who do we trust, Robert?
I trust the people who are in those homes.
Okay,
And I trust nobody. I trust the people.
I would agree with that. We got to treat people as adults, and if you give them something, they might take care of it. I think
They might
they
rent
would.
it out. They might improve it. They
Yeah,
might,
yeah.
and that's exactly what happened in the former Soviet republics. A private banking system and a private property system was put into place overnight in countries that hadn't known it for more than 50 years. And I think if we can get out of this Soviet-style system, we'll get rid of the corporatist style banking system that we have right now that I believe does not have our liberty, our interest of liberty at heart. I think that they want to take away our liberty, and they're doing it by restricting what we can, what you can purchase. Like you were mentioning, the gun shops that are being targeted. I think that's exactly where this is going. I don't trust them one iota because they haven't proven that they deserve my trust.
Well said.
One of the great
we
things
got to wrap
about-
it up here.
One of the great things that we know is consolidated power always is corrupted. So the best way to do it is to blow it up and have not literally.
Tell us, do a little ad for Americans for Limited Government. I love your mission. What's your mission?
Yeah,
Restate
our
it.
mission is to limit size and scope in government at all levels, and it's
maximize individual freedom.
individual freedom. Absolutely,
Treat people like adults.
We
Constitution.
essentially look at the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and say that's the DNA of the country, and that's what we're defending.
Yeah.
And we defended it at every turn, and truthfully, it's hard because every mechanism in D.C. is against that. But it's a great mission, and believe it or not, folks, sometimes we win. So
we do. I'm with you. So, Robert, I guess you gave a great summary there. Do you want another oration? That
well, you could just check us out at dailytorch.com. That's where we post our op-eds. We have Tony
and you
Bronco.
also publish. Where do you? I get an email feed from you.
Right.
Is that every day you're writing something?
That's dailytorch.com. Yeah, I probably have written more than 3,000 articles for Americans for Limited Government since 2008.
And where do we find you guys?
Again, that's dailytorch.com. That's where you will get the written op-eds and Tony Bronco cartoons. We also do a lot of videos now that we're, getting into
The
that.
cartoons are great fun.
Oh, absolutely.
Tony Bronco's brilliant.
Yeah.
And most people have seen him on Fox News because Fox News picks him up because he's free. I pay for him. They get it for free. Figure that out. But they get my cartoons for free. But the point is, this is one of the things that I think matters because we send this to every editorial board in the country every day. We send it to the broadcasters, the talk radio people all across the country every day.
Every member of Congress.
Last year, I was in 250,000 radio markets last year alone. So this stuff reaches. We're reaching people, and our goal is not to just do your jaw will drop. Our goal is to get people to understand what actually is going on in the world and check it out. We put sources in it. We encourage people to click the link,
bill.
read the bill, read the regulations.
Engage, yeah.
Don't trust the politicians to tell
don't
you.
trust us.
Yeah.
Okay? Do your own research, but we provide the means to do so.
Yeah.
And as a result, we hope to make people smarter and better advocates for their own freedom, whether we exist or not.
And the members of Congress, too. They need that information because I believe they're getting bad information right now.
We do send it to every member of Congress as well. We used to send it to the administration, but they don't take it anymore.
We've got a lot of dangling stuff that we need to follow up. The big cliffhanger is we didn't talk about even non-bank alternatives for financing, and there's a big market emerging out there because of all the bad stuff.
Right.
Anyway, we got to wrap it up. To be continued. How's that?
Very good.
This has been the Bill Walton Show, and I've been here with Rick Manning and Robert Romano of Americans for Limited Government in a wide-ranging conversation where I think we've covered a lot. But the essence really is that we do need to be concerned about our banking system and its threat to liberty, which is something that's not always been on the horizon, but it should be now. So anyway, stay tuned for upcoming shows. As you know, we're on all the major podcast platforms and YouTube and Rumble. We're on CPAC now on Monday nights. We're now publishing on Substack, where we're getting a very nice following, and also obviously on our website, thebillwaltonshow.com. And there's opportunities there, particularly in Substack, to send your comments about what you think about what we're talking about here, and offer up suggestions about next shows we ought to be focusing on. Anyway, so thanks for tuning in with Rick and Robert, and hope you enjoyed it. And we'll be talking soon. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Want more? Click the subscribe button or head over to thebillwaltonshow.com to choose from over 100 episodes. You can also learn more about our guest on our Interesting People page. And send us your comments. We read every one, and your thoughts help us guide the show. If it's easier for you to listen, check out our podcast page and subscribe there. In return, we'll keep you informed about what's true, what's right, and what's next. Thanks for joining.